Okay, class. With this video, we're going to turn to the Acropolis in Athens and talk about, and this will be the first of lectures. We'll talk about the structures on the Acropolis in Athens and then move on to other buildings of the 5th century. The Acropolis simply means the high city in Greek. The acro, high, like acrophobic, and polis, city. Um, these would exist in other cities as well, where they would build a city around a high ground. So, should they be under attack, they could run to that area. Moreover, they would do things like use these areas as banks, and as we'll see, as well, we won't see, but it was that the Parthenon, this structure, this temple to Athena, was also used as a bank. It was used to house money. It was a holy precinct, and so could not be robbed. But played a very important part in Athens. Every city, remember, had its own patron deity. Athens, it was Athena. And this is the great 5th century temple that is probably one of the most influential buildings in Western architecture, and would have a great impact on all subsequent architecture, including Roman and including, American and Washington, D.C., as I believe I discussed in the last class. So we're going to go back over this a little bit and then jump into it in greater detail. And this is the first lecture for the Acropolis, and we're going to be looking at this structure specifically, the Parthenon. But as you'll see, there are other buildings on the Acropolis, this just being the main one. And it was a temple to the patron deity of Athens, Athena. And they had a temple there for a long time in Athens, but their old temple, which I'll show you parts of in a moment, would get destroyed in 490, 480 BC, by a Persian invasion, in which Xerxes took over the city of Athens and destroyed the old Parthenon, or the old Acropolis, the old temple to Athena that was there. And this, the one we know now, was built after that destruction. I should just point out that the Persian Empire was by far the largest empire in the world at that time. And in fact, the Greeks did a good job of holding them away from Athens in 490 BC, but in 480 they ended up taking it and destroying the city. But eventually the Greeks would be able to repel them, but they would be a problem now for the Greeks and for a couple hundred more years to go, down all the way to Alexander the Great. And here we see the extension of the Persian Empire, the extent of it, I should say. They had controlled Egypt. They had made it across the Himalayas down into India and took the Indus River Valley. They controlled all of what we would call Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, Turkey, and would even make it into Europe and take what was called Thrace and control the Bosporus, that is to say, this a strait in between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, that was really important for the distribution of food. Here we see a map of it on the left, and we can see the various buildings that are on the Parthenon. In addition to the Parthenon, we will talk about the Erechtheion to the left there, and the Propylaea, the gate at the bottom of the slide on the left, to the right of the slide on top, or to the right-hand side of the slide on the right bottom. And so this, we'll talk about several buildings, but today we'll just talk about the Parthenon. Once again, this is dedicated to Athena. Parthenos, which means the virgin goddess, because she was of virgin birth. You'll need to know this for the iconography we'll see in a moment, and we'll talk about her statue later on. Before the Acropolis, before the Parthenon, I should say, there was a building that we just know from records primarily called the Hecatompedon, which just means the 100-foot structure. And we have some sculptures of like these strange serpent-like creatures from the pediment. This is carved and painted limestone of these one-time mythical founders of the of Athens. We won't go into that. I just want to show you that there was a structure there. We can see it's a on the left. Its reconstruction is a Doric structure, but not a hypostyle temple. But we'll, as we will soon see with the new Parthenon. Here's just another shot of it from the front. Those on the center of the photo is the gateway, the Propylaea. I'll come back to that later. And when you walk up into the Propylaea, to the right, you see the Parthenon, which I'll talk about in this class. Now, the Parthenon, as I said, was destroyed. The old one, the Hecatompedon, was destroyed by the Persians in 480 BC. It would be rebuilt by a guy by the name of Pericles, who was the political leader of Athens at the time. And he would have it rebuilt in about 12 years. He would form what's called the Delian League, in which he after the Persian defeat in 480, they were still a threat, and so he organized all the Greeks to put money aside, and they'd put it at the holy island of Delos, where there was a sanctuary to Apollo. And the money would be banked there, and it would be used to build ships in order to protect the Greeks from further Persian attack. The Athenians and their ships were very important in stopping the Persian attacks in 480, and so they were given some special preference here, although other Greeks had fought, the Spartans, etc. But the Pericles would then take the money, and in this agreement for the Delian League, he said, "Oh, and let's put some money aside to rebuild our temples." And everybody thought, "Okay, that's legitimate. Everybody has to have their temples, etc." What they didn't know is he would proceed to build the nicest Greek temple ever built, and use the most expensive materials, and get the best architects, Iktinos and Callicrates, as well as the best artists, Phidias, who had also already done Olympia, to do the sculptures at Athens, or at the Acropolis, the Parthenon specifically. I should point out that the Parthenon that we were familiar with had also suffered a great attack in the 17th century A.D. The Ottomans had controlled Athens at the time, and they were under attack by the Venetians, and the Ottomans used the Parthenon as an armory. We can see in the reconstruction to the left, there's even a minaret there because they also used it as a mosque. But the Venetians bombed it for several days, until finally one bomb made it through the roof and into the center and blew the top off it, and then would proceed to shatter the marbles that were in the pediments and on the entablature off the side of it, and let it sort of lay around. And they would lay around for almost 150 years, until a guy I'm about to introduce you to, Lord Elgin, would take them to London in the British Museum. Here's another image of its destruction in 1687. When it blew the roof off it. Now there's only one temple left, a Greek temple with a roof. Actually, just below this one in the Agora. But here we see this reconstruction of it. And here is the guy, Lord Elgin. His name is Thomas Bruce. He was the in charge of the area of Elgin, or we say it in American, Elgin. And he spent much time in Athens, and made an agreement with the Ottoman Turks to allow him to purchase a whole bunch of the sculptures that were laying around, and he had them taken back to London, where they, in fact, started the British Museum. And they are still one of the main attractions of the British Museum, and indeed got the British Museum started, basically, and made it a famous museum that it still is to this day. This is back in the time when the French and the Germans are just plundering artifacts from all over the place. And that's why a lot of times, if you want to study ancient Greece or ancient Egypt or other ancient cultures, you have to go to the British Museum or the Louvre in Paris to see many, many, many of them. And the marble sculptures that were taken by this guy, Elgin, are called the Elgin marbles, at least by the English-speaking world. They should be called the Parthenon marbles. And I will show you some images of those after we discuss the architecture. But once again, they are in the British Museum. Here is another plan, once again, just to reacquaint you with this. We're going to be talking about the building on the right, top right. But later on, we'll talk about the Erechtheion on the top left, and then the Propylaea, the gate on the entranceway on the bottom. These all were worked together because they were part of what's called the Panathenaic procession, which is a procession that took place every year, and every fourth year there was even a big Panathenaic procession. But what it represents was the union of the 10 Athenian tribes to come together and, who came together and helped form the city of Athens that would go on to be the first democracy and the great city of the 5th and 4th century BC in Greece. And here we see this. So there's this procession every year. The Athenians would get together and they would march up through the Propylaea, the gate here, and then go to the Parthenon on the right that had a statue of Athena, and they would leave her offerings and then go celebrate outside. And so this was basically, celebrating the fact that they were Athenians. And here's a goofy picture of me standing in front of the Propylaea, this sort of walkway that you zigzag up to the entrance. You zigzag now. Back then you walked straight up. But there's been a lot of reconstruction over time by foreign invaders of this outside area. But if you go up and you go through that gate, then this is what you see, which is this three-quarter view of the Parthenon. And it just shows its wonderful sort of harmonic organization or distribution of its columns. Once again, its length is twice as many columns on the front plus one. And let me get you a nice shot where I'm not in it. And here's a photograph that you will never be able to take yourself because there has been some sort of scaffolding somewhere around the Parthenon my whole life. And so this is the only time you ever really see it without some sort of scaffolding somewhere. There was a time prior to Thomas Bruce or Lord Elgin where a lot of sculptures were just laying around the surface here, not considered very important until he purchased them from the Ottomans. By the way, the Greeks have wanted them back ever since. I mean, they've said that they didn't sell them to the British, that the occupiers did. But that has been at an impasse and continues to be at an impasse until this very day. And things still come up in the news. There was something in the news once again recently about this battle between the Greeks and the Brits. Here's just another shot to just show you how spectacular and beautiful this is. They light it up at night, which obviously wasn't done in antiquity, at least with not such brilliant lighting. But on the right, you see how there's this a rocky mound in the center of the city, and that's where this is built. And once again, this is where they'd run for refuge should they be under attack. Here's a reconstruction of what it looked like, and I show this to you because it was chock-a-block full of of buildings. And so when you go there now, it seems pretty empty except for the entranceway, the Propylaea, on the bottom right here. To the left, another building called the Erechtheia, and I'll talk about that later, and then the Parthenon itself. But there are many other buildings on the Acropolis, but they're now missing. The Parthenon itself housed the statue of Athena Parthenos, that is to say, the Virgin Athena, but she is dressed in what's called pro-makos, that is to say, before battle. And we know this because of the descriptions of it. We don't have any of this statue left, but we know from descriptions of it, it was a chryselephantine statue. Chryselephantine means partially gold and partially ivory. So that gives you an idea of just how expensive this statue was. And she stands there with her helmet pushed up to her forehead so we can see her face, her spear and shield on her left side, and on the right she holds a ball upon which stands Nike, the female statue that represents victory, Nike. And here she is shown. By the way, don't forget this is built right after they defeated the Persians, or soon thereafter. So this victory is to represent their victory over the Persians. Here is another reconstruction of it. And to give you an idea of the size, there was a lot of gold put into this. So it was, in many ways, it operated as a bank. And in fact, the plates of gold that were put on the statue were all sort of weighed and measured beforehand, so she could be used as sort of collateral, not collateral, I should say, but they knew how much gold she is worth in case of an emergency, I guess. And once again, they would have the annual procession up to her statue to celebrate being Athenian. Now, the Parthenon is made out of a marble from the island of Paros. I showed you Naxos before, where the Koroi, statues of the Koroi, not taken out of the quarry yet, were from. Paros is right beside it, and it has this nice white marble. Here's a photograph of a modern quarry. I wish I could find my pictures of my trip there, because this is cut into a mountainside, and each one of these blocks is, they're huge. They're like a quarter of the size of the campus, each one of these. They're just massive blocks. And so they can be cut out and then, taken wherever they need to be taken, and then chopped up into smaller blocks, etc. So Pericles gets the best marble he can get from Paros to build the Parthenon. Here's what it looks like now. Here's what it looked like in antiquity. This is showing you the west side. I'll explain that in a moment. I just want to point out, though, that once again, I mentioned this last class, that these were heavily painted temples. So the idea that they were all white and pristine is simply not true. As a matter of fact, the sculptures here are still left white with some parts painted, but that's not even true. They were probably completely painted. And here it is from the front. You can see with 8 columns. Notice the 2 columns to the right and left are a little bit closer. We noticed that before. And here it is from the side. The left would be the east entrance, which is the main face of all Greek temples. They face east, and the statue is held inside in what's called the cella. And here is a reconstruction of it. So there was columns around the peripteral columns around the whole Parthenon, and then just some in front and the back of the cella for the roof. And you'd go in there, and there would be the altar to Athena. Once again, remember that these are not places where you'd be proselytized, right? These are not places where you'd go in and then a priest would tell you, try to convince you of the good of this deity and to convert or whatever. They were polytheistic societies. They had many deities, and Athena was their patron deity for their city. I just want to show you on the corner here there's the pedimental sculptures that were in the triangular area above the face of them, but also we're going to pay attention to the metopes shown here, and you can see on the left where this one is painted with a red background. And so we'll have the stories there's the pedimental sculptures that tell stories of Athens, and then there are the ones in the metopes that go around all four sides of the Parthenon, which I'll talk about as well. And once again, here's the reconstruction. So you can see the metopes going along the top there, underneath the roof, in the blue and the yellow, blue and yellow. And so they continue on all four sides. Now, one thing that's fascinating about the Parthenon is that the architects were quite good at visual measures, I should say, or how to make things look as perfect as possible. And one of the things they did was they arched their base a little bit, which, for reasons that are beyond me, make it actually look a bit flatter. Make I shouldn't say flatter, but make the columns look straight up. And if for some reason, if it had been completely flat, the columns would have looked like they were tilting in a little bit. They, in fact, tilt out a little bit, but they look even to us, or straight up and down, perpendicular. Interestingly enough, no two blocks or column drums on the Parthenon are the same because of this foundation. Every single one of them is slightly different. And you can see on the left, it looks straight, but in fact, well, the one on the top left, you can see it arches a little bit in the center, but for the most part, you don't. And this makes for perfect design to see at a three-quarter view as you enter into the Parthenon. Enter onto the Acropolis and see the Parthenon. I should point out that there is a replica of this in Nashville, Tennessee. I have not seen it, but if you're ever down in that area, you can see a replica of it. And once again, here is this is a facade from the other side, the west side of it, which I'll explain shortly. I do want to point out that it's something I mentioned in a previous lecture, that the columns that have this entasis, that is to say, it is swelling in the middle to give it a cigar shape. But as you can see, when you stand right underneath the columns, you don't see it at all. So it has, it tricks the eye to a certain extent, which is just, shows how well they understood what they were doing here, and so that, just to give you a nice idea of how these columns look from directly below and the shadows that the fluting casts. Now, okay, to return to the Parthenon in general, you go up through the entrance here on the center of the slide and then turn to the right, as I showed you before. Now, I want to talk about the pedimental sculptures in this lecture. We'll get to the other sculptures in another. On the east side, the front of the temple was the birth of Athena. You can see how much is preserved now, and you can go to the British Museum and see most of these sculptures, although there's a couple in Paris and then a couple in Athens, but they're primarily in the British Museum. So if you're a specialist on the Parthenon, you have to study both in Athens and in London. You can see what's preserved of these. So her birth is on one side. On the west side is a battle between her and Poseidon. What happened is that when the Athenians yet to have a patron deity, there was a battle between Poseidon and Athena, and Poseidon struck the earth with his trident and created a spring of water float up. Well, then Athena competed with it, and this all happens, by the way, on the Acropolis. She strikes her spear to the ground, and an olive tree grows. And the Athenians decide, well, olive trees are more valuable than water, and so they choose her. And so the east pediment shows the birth of Athena. The west pediment shows how she became the patron deity of Athens. I should mention on the side, you can't see it in the slide before that well, but in the mythologically speaking, what happens is that Athena is born from Poseidon's head. He gets her mother Metis pregnant. Now, Metis, the word in Greek it means intelligence in Greek. And so he's afraid that because of her intelligence, she will usurp power. So he eats Metis. She will usurp power, or her offspring will. So he eats Metis after making love with her, and she's pregnant. But then Athena is born out of his head. He gets a headache. Hephaestus clubs him over the head with his axe, and then Athena pops out of his head, full born. And so she's of virgin birth, and that's why Parthenos means virgin, because she is of virgin birth, and we see the concept of virgin birth predates Christianity. And just another shot of the Parthenon here. Once again, I want to point out the bottom right slide here, where the bottom right is the entrance, but the center is the structure we'll talk about. We're talking about now the Parthenon on the Acropolis. This is the entrance to the Acropolis, called the Propylaea. We'll come back to that in greater detail as we go through the lectures on this. But if you'd walk through the Propylaea, turn around, this is what you'd see. Here's a plan of it. Once again, I'll return to all of this. But as you would enter, then you would be able to see the Parthenon itself. And I will stop there, and we will pick up with the other structures and the marble sculptures that are on this most important of Greek temples. And we'll pick up there in the next lecture.